this view that the person with knowledge should have authority over others, rather that if we need people with knowledge, we can hire them. What, though, about liberals' ideas concerning government? From a liberal perspective, government is limited in its scope and its function for the reason that I mentioned before, by what citizens will consent to and also in respect of individual rights. Liberals, with regard to how government works, now favour democracy. During the 19th century, I think things weren't quite so clear-cut. Often liberals then were a bit worried about the extension of the franchise, the granting of votes to more and more people. Why? Well, one of their big worries was that if you have majorities that are poor, might they not get together and simply take the property of the rich? May they not disregard the rights of the rich? And from this point of view, there's always, I mean, you can talk about our own society as being a liberal democracy, a kind of compromise between liberalism and democracy. Well, there's a sense in which liberals typically now favour what one might call a self-limiting democracy. That's to say, a situation in which there's democracy, but where constitutions entrench certain rights against simple majority rule. That there are certain things that the government or one's fellow citizens can't do to you because you've got rights, which in a sense can serve to trump certain kinds of majority decision-taking. As to government, the proper role of government is really a matter of controversy between liberals. All liberals, I think you could say, agree with the ideal of the rule of law. That's to say, the notion that law should be general in its character. It shouldn't pick out particular individuals for special treatment by name. Law should be publicly available. One should be able to discover in advance what the law says about some kind of issue, and also that the law shouldn't be retrospective, that government also should act normally only on the basis of the law, although it's generally granted that in some kind of dire emergencies it may need to act where there aren't the full powers. But in the ordinary course of things, government should be restricted to specific powers that it's been given by law. You also get the notion within liberalism that the state should be broadly neutral between people's different concerns. In this context, one might think of the freedom of religion as giving a useful model, which then, in a sense, is generalized. You have the notion under liberal ideas about freedom of religion that the state, as it were, shouldn't be in favour of one religion rather than another. It should be offering general protection in this area. And so one can see in this field the notion of a freedom of opinion as a kind of generalization of that. All one might say, though, is that there are particularly among groups sometimes referred to as sects, cases where freedom of religion doesn't seem to be extended in quite the same sort of way, and there's some difficult decisions as to how they should be treated. There is, I guess, controversy, though, about the proper scope of state activity amongst liberals. Let's look here at two contrasting views of the liberal state. First of all, you may get liberals who say, look, what the state historically has been or what it should be is a state that is limited in its functions. The prime functions of the state should be those of the so-called night watchman state. And you could say nowadays the private security company state, namely looking after matters of defence and law and order, that people and their property should be protected, and one is seeing this, in a sense, as being the core functions that the state should be discharging. To this, those people who take this rather limited view of the state will say, OK, there may be a few things you need to add to it. There is first the provision of so-called public goods. What are these? Well, these are things which people need, but which it's argued are either not provided or are under-provided by markets. When does this happen? Well, economists have written a whole bunch about these things, but there are usually two things that they invoke. First of all, the notion that consumption of something by one person doesn't exclude what's available to others, and also there's the idea that you can't exclude people who don't pay from benefiting. How can one bring this home in more concrete terms? Well, one obvious example is defence. That's to say, if defence is being provided, there's a sense in which if I consume defence functions, if I'm being protected, it doesn't diminish what's available for others. And in a similar kind of way, if I say I have a conscientious objection to paying my taxes in respect of the military, well, even if I can get away with that, and I think that the IRS aren't likely to be too open to the idea, there's a sense in which I'm going to be protected anyway. That's to say, you can't here say, right, Shearmur isn't going to be protected, if Russia or China or anyone else wants to bomb, they can bomb Shearmur, but they must leave the rest of it comes as a sort of whole package. Another kind of example would be advertising free-to-air broadcasting. I mean, there's a sense similarly there that if it's being put out, anyone can pick it up and so on. And a number of economists have argued that there are a whole bunch of things of this kind where if you simply relied on markets and voluntary transactions, you'd get under provision and that government should be brought in. There are also other kinds of functions that some people have said should be added to this. For example, things which are needed but can't be provided by way of market mechanisms. The role of a state reserve bank, for example, has been argued to be of such a character, although some would contest it. Also, you might say, well, what about the medical control of epidemics? I mean, you may need government to be involved here. In addition, some people who take this rather minimal view would say, okay, over and above the sort of things that I've been talking about so far, one needs to add to some rather limited welfare and educational functions, perhaps a very limited welfare safety net for those people who are otherwise going to be destitute, some basic schooling or perhaps vouchers for it for the children of the very poor, possibly also the provision of public libraries, but it doesn't really go any further than that. And it's also worth noting that some classical liberals, libertarians, who I'm going to talk about in a later lecture, want to slim down or even get rid of some or even all of these functions for the state. By way of contrast, they're those people who favour the welfare state. Those who take this view say, on the one side, the state should undertake all the sorts of functions that I've mentioned so far, but also it should add other things too. It should add welfare services, for example, medical and social benefits and social insurance. In addition, the state should guarantee whatever it might be that individuals need in order to develop their talents and to participate actively as citizens. Clearly, if they can take care of themselves and they don't need any special help, they wouldn't get it. But if they're falling short of these things, then it's necessary for the state to be in there, just because ideas about individual autonomy and self-development are, from this perspective, so important. The state also should do what it can to foster equal opportunities in a market-based society. There are limitations with regard to what can be done over and above making sure that there's the rule of law. But if there are things that the state can do without mucking up all other kinds of social arrangements, then it should be in there too. And there is, and this has come to the fore most recently, also perhaps the possibility of a certain amount of paternalistic action of protecting adult citizens from themselves, from things that might otherwise lead them astray. This is always a bit controversial in terms of liberalism, but there's a sense in which some people, welfare liberals, may want to extend the function of the state in this direction. The key and indeed contemporary issue to which this then leads is, why is there disagreement between liberals about these things and what might be said on one side rather than the other? This is an issue that I'm going to pursue in the next lecture. In this present lecture, I want to take up one other really important issue, one which in a sense feeds into this kind of disagreement. It relates to different ideas that liberals may have about liberty or freedom itself. The view that many classical liberals or limited state liberals have is a view which, following the British political theorist Sir Isaiah Berlin, is quite often referred to as a negative view of liberty. From this perspective, the heart of liberty is an absence of external constraint. That's to say, basically from this perspective, you are free provided you're not being constrained by someone or something outside of yourself. I would be free, say, to walk off in this direction until I hit into the wall, which would then be a form of external constraint on me. In a similar kind of sense, if other people were to seize me or to seize my property or whatever, this would be an external constraint. And the heart of liberty, from this perspective, is a freedom from external constraint. More generally, and in a kind of fuller sense, you and also your property shouldn't be interfered